This move immediately seizes central space, opens lines for the queen and bishop, and prepares for rapid development of kingside pieces. This move, 1. c5, initiates the Sicilian defense, a highly combative and strategically complex opening aiming to unbalance the position from the outset by challenging white's central pawn. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a highly dynamic and complex opening where white establishes central control with a pawn while developing a knight to a natural square, preparing for kingside castling and increased central pressure against black's asymmetrical pawn structure. This move, nc6, is a common and solid continuation in the Sicilian defense, developing a piece and supporting the d-pawn, preparing for a flexible fight for the center. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a complex and theoretically rich defense, aiming to immediately challenge black's central pawn structure and create dynamic imbalances. This move opens the position, challenging white's central pawn and allowing black to develop a piece later, aiming for a dynamic and potentially imbalanced Sicilian defense. This move, nxd4, is the most common and principled way to continue in the open Sicilian, immediately challenging black's central pawn and recapturing material while developing a piece. This move initiates the fianchetto variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the long diagonal with the bishop and prepare for a kingside pawn storm or solidifying the center. This move, b3, prepares to castle kingside and supports the central pawn advances with piece development, aiming for a flexible setup against black's fianchettoed bishop. This move signals black's intention to enter a king's Indian defense setup, aiming for a fianchettoed bishop on g7 to control the long diagonal. This move solidifies white's central pawn control, aiming to restrict black's pieces and prepare for a queenside pawn advance, typical of many Sicilian variations. This move solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares to fianchetto the light-squared bishop, aiming for a king's Indian defense setup within the Sicilian framework. Developing another knight to c3 solidifies the center and prepares for further queenside expansion, a common theme in the Yugoslav attack against the accelerated dragon. This develops the knight to its most natural square in the Sicilian defense. Dragon variation, preparing to castle kingside and centralizing the piece. Developing the bishop to e2 prepares for kingside castling, solidifying the pawn structure and bringing another piece into the game for potential central control. This move prepares to castle kingside, a crucial step in solidifying the position and activating the king into the game's middle stages. Castling kingside secures the monarch and connects the rooks, preparing to activate them on the central files or potentially a queenside expansion. Black castles to safety, completing an important development phase and preparing to connect the rooks, while also avoiding any immediate central skirmishes. This move initiates the aggressive Maroczy bind setup within the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the d5 square and restrict black's queenside play while preparing a kingside attack. This move immediately challenges white's aggressively advanced pawn chain, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable central control and potentially create tactical opportunities by exploiting the unprotected knight on d4. This exchange resolves the tension in the center, opening lines and forcing black to decide whether to recapture with the pawn or the knight, impacting their kingside development. Black recaptures, developing the bishop and opening the g-file for potential future activity. This move simplifies the position, exchanges a developed knight for a bishop, and aims to create a favorable pawn structure for white in the center. This move re-establishes the pawn structure and prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially developing the queen to a more active square. This move sacrifices the knight for a pawn and opens up the g-file for potential attack after black recaptures, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside. This move defends the king from the immediate check and repositions it to a safer square on the h8 file, which is less likely to be exploited by white's pieces. This move centralizes the queen, supporting the knight's potential fork on f7 and preparing to contest the d-file while also reinforcing the king's safety. After the tactical exchange on e7, recapturing the knight with the queen creates an immediate imbalance, opening the d-file for white's rook and potentially exposing black's king. This knight maneuver aims to exploit white's advantage in space and activity, potentially targeting weaknesses on black's kingside or creating tactical opportunities with a subsequent move like f5. The recapture of the knight on c6 has opened lines for white's queen and bishop, and this move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing for central play or attacks on the kingside. This pawn thrust prepares to open the f-file for aggressive play against black's king, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around it. This move opens the g-file for black's rook, creating counterplay and challenging white's central pawn majority. This captures the pawn on f5, opening the e-file for your rook and creating tactical possibilities against black's kingside defenses. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, challenging white's central control and potentially preparing to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king. This move prepares to develop the kingside defense and potentially challenge black's bishop on e5 by creating an escape square for the king. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weak dark squares around white's king and preparing to challenge white's control of the center. This knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure created by white's previous pawn sacrifices, and potential to launch further attacks. This exchange simplifies the position and frees the e-file for white's rook, while black aims to improve coordination of their pieces. This exchange clears the central squares and prepares for an active piece play by white, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive bishop placement. This move defends the e7 pawn and prepares to reroute the g8 rook to the more active h8 square, aiming to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially challenge white's central control. This move activates the rook to the semi-open e-file, aiming to pressure white's central pawn structure and potentially support future advances or exchanges on the e-file. Developing the rook to the d-file now contests the open file and prepares to support the pawn push on d6 if black chooses to recapture there. This aggressive pawn push aims to open lines on the kingside, targeting black's king and attempting to exploit the weakened dark squares. Black's move qc6 aims to support the f-pawn's advance by potentially creating a battery on the c6 diagonal, while also freeing the d-file for the rook. This move centralizes the queen, creating threats against black's king and pawns while supporting white's advanced f5 pawn and potential kingside expansion. This move brings the rook to the d7 square, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially support a future d5 pawn push, while also defending the vulnerable knight on d5 from further threats. This move initiates an attack on black's kingside pawn structure and aims to exploit the open h-file for white's remaining rook.